Hello and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the library. And tonight I'm so delighted to be welcoming our writer-in-residence, Stacy Schiff, in conversation with the brilliant and wonderful Elaine Sciolino, who has returned to the library once more. If this is your first time at the library, welcome. We're delighted to have you. We've been in operation for over 100 years, and we're the largest English language lending library on the European continent. We host events like this 2 to 3 times per week, and we partner with multiple institutions across Paris, and most recently in Cannes as well. So I highly encourage you to look at our program's calendar, either printed out in your seat or on our website, to see what else we have coming up. Just a couple of notes about this conversation tonight. After about 45 minutes, we are going to be opening it up to our audience for questions, both in person and, if we have time, our Zoom audience as well, who's inside that camera right there. Hello, Zoom audience. Thank you for joining us virtually. So if you have a question, put it in the chat or sit tight. And following this conversation, copies of Stacy's wonderful, remarkable books will be available for purchase, and she will be generously signing 1 or 2, so I highly encourage you to purchase them. And there will be a reception, which has been generously provided by the Groot Foundation. So have a bite, purchase a book, have a sip of wine, and enjoy yourselves. On to our brilliant speakers tonight. Stacy Schiff is the author of Véra, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Saint-Exupéry, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, winner of the George Washington Book Prize. Published to ecstatic reviews, her Cleopatra, A Life was a #1 bestseller, named one of the New York Times top 10 books of 2010. It has been translated into 35 languages and won the PEN Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for Biography. The revolutionary Samuel Adams was a Wall Street Journal top 10 book of 2022 and casually figured as well on President Obama's list of favorite books of 2022. The Wall Street Journal has called Schiff perhaps the most seductive writer of nonfiction prose in America in our time. Stacy is a writer-in-residence at the American Library for only a couple more days, unfortunately. This program is generously sponsored by the Groot Foundation as well, and it's been such a pleasure to see Stacy at work and to get to know her. We're so delighted to have her in our community. And in conversation with Stacy tonight is Miss Elaine Sciolino, who is a contributing writer and former Paris bureau chief for the New York Times. Her forthcoming book, Adventures in the Louvre, How to Fall in Love with the World's Greatest Museum, will be published in 2025. Decorated Chevalier of the Legion of Honor by the French state, she is the author of national bestsellers The Seine and The Only Street in Paris. She has lived in Paris since 2002. Elaine, Stacy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Can we have a round of applause, please?
This is really fun for me. I met Stacy just last week in New York, and I feel like I have a new best friend. So it's really, really cool.
We're writing a book together.
I thought we were doing
Did you not know that?
I thought we were doing a podcast first.
I think we should talk after this.
Yeah. Okay. But it's really nice in my age to get a new best friend, isn't it? I mean, think about it. It's really very cool. Okay, welcome back to the American Library family. When you were honored here in 2017, you told your audience that the American Library serves an ambassadorial function for the foreigner and a refuge to the expat. Tonight, the library is also a place of partage, of sharing, a venue for coming together and celebrating you and your work over the years. Now, Emily, I want you to put up, if you can, a slide. It's the only slide, but this shows the weird and wonderful way that Stacy Schiff works.
I'm afraid to turn around.
Just wait till you hear. There's some writers here in the audience. I just want to tell you how, and I'm a newspaper journalist, so we got to just churn it out. I write longhand with a mechanical pencil on a yellow legal pad. Okay, that's fine. I am specific about the pad. College-ruled, perforated, double red line at the margin. Agnostic about the pencil. I then type the draft into the computer. It gets printed and edited, the pencil again, and reprinted endlessly. I don't think as fast as I type. The tactile connection with the paper and the enforced speed limit seems to assist the mental process insofar as anything does, aside from caffeine. If you think by writing and you write by hand, you've built in time to ponder. With a pencil, I'm more limber, more thoughtful, more open to the unexpected roundabouts and loop the loops.
I think you've just outed me completely, Elaine. Was there a question in there?
No, it's about joy. We're talking, you call it the joy of biography. And I assume that this is joyful to sit here. And you said you were once left-handed. You know, if you're left-handed, you write like this. So how does it all work?
Yeah, we need a couch for that piece of the conversation.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to the de Groots who are not here. Thank you, Emily, for making me feel so at home in this amazing building. And Elaine, I mean, what a treat. So American Library Paris, like 3 of my favorite things in one phrase. It's incredible. Chocolate American Library in Paris, and it would be a done deal. So yes, I still do it this way. I can't see behind me, so I can't tell what book that is, but it pretty much still looks that way. I'm guessing that's an early-ish book because there's not a lot of crossing out, and I think I've become more of a champion crosser-outer as I've gotten older, or more fussy as a writer. I'm not sure which is closer to the truth. But I would say that I don't know how you all feel when I type. Whatever I'm writing gets longer because typing is easy and writing is really arduous. The page resists you. And increasingly as we type, I think our penmanship has disintegrated and the hand resists you. So when I type, anything by definition becomes longer and perhaps a little fatter. And there's a lot of lard in there. And when I write by hand, there's a built-in concision along with, I think, some of the thought that just kind of it's actually sort of artisanal. I mean, this is manual labor, and somehow the words and the thoughts do seem, for me, to connect in a way that wouldn't normally connect when my fingers are flying across a keyboard. And part of this is I am a champion typist. I'm a crazy good typist.
How did you do that? Did you take
I took typing in
high
7th
school?
grade. Yeah, it was the best course I ever took.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I never took typing
because... It was the
because...
football team and I
yeah.
made I had boyfriends for the next few years. It was great.
I never took typing because I didn't want to become a secretary. So... When the
I
nun
became
said
the secretary, so you did it well.
Yeah,
How's your typing? Are you hunting and pecking?
I type slowly, so maybe I do more thinking, or maybe it's just old age. It's just the fingers are moving more slowly. But I think that's fascinating because it's really pre-computer because it's saying I'm not going to vomit onto the page. I'm going to think before I put something down.
I should also say that writers are, as many of you know, very superstitious creatures, and I've never done it any other way. So I would be terrified. I mean, I have never written so much as an article or even a short answer to a journalist's question any other way. And I think I'm probably just, dinosaurishly stuck in my way.
Or thoughtful.
Although I do know several other people who commit literature like this,
Yeah.
so I don't feel entirely isolated.
Well, to get back to this idea of joy, I don't know.
This is not joy. This is torture, by the way.
Well, I don't know very many people who would call their writing joyful, and so I was really intrigued by the idea of the joy of biography. So tell us a little bit about when do you find joy in your work?
About 5 years after publication. You're in an archive and you suddenly unearth something. I'm trying to think of a perfect example. You're in the archives of, let's say, the Venetian ambassador to Paris. And he is reporting on every Tuesday at Versailles when the entire ambassadorial corps has come to pay homage to Louis XVI. And he has included in his account back to Venice lines of Benjamin Franklin's that were spoken at court that no one has ever read before. I mean, that's kind of joyful, right? When
Yes.
you realize not only you've got it, but, I can actually use this. As opposed to the things you end up using just because they took you so much time that you think this is going in no matter what, right?
Well, it's interesting because in one of your interviews you talk about training, and you said you could have trained as a private investigator, but you also could have trained as a diplomatic correspondent, because if I could share with you this process, about a year and a half into your Franklin book, it's suddenly the light bulb went on and you realized that every ambassador had to report back to Capitol what Franklin was saying. So Stacy didn't just note that in a footnote. She went to all the different places where the ambassadors were. So she went to Venice and Vienna and Lisbon and Denmark and maybe even Sweden. And did you have to hire translators? And she went into the archives, the state archives of all these places, and read what the ambassadors had to say about the process and about the.
And that might just be even more lunatic than this when you think about it.
No, it's not, because it's a key. And I see Jim Bitterman back there. This is a key trick of diplomatic correspondence. You don't just listen to what the White House or the president or the Secretary of State says. You go around and you talk to all the other governments. So, in fact, can I just tell one story about being a journalist? But it's the perfect thing. When Clinton had just come to power and they were trying to sell the Balkan project to, the aerial attacks in Bosnia, Warren Christopher went to all the capitals, and then they briefed us on what happened. And, some of us went and talked to, like, the British and the French, and we said, well, that's nice that you said that to Mike McCurry, who was in the spokesman. And we said, but the British and the French say it was completely different, and they rejected your whole plan. And he said, you mean foreign governments leak like we do? And that's exactly what Stacy was doing. You were being a diplomatic correspondent.
You give me a lot of credit. I will say that sort of whole ambassadorial corps was like a Greek chorus, because you suddenly had this enormous new swath of material that no one had really mined before. And then I've had that with previous books, and it's really interesting because you realize the imperfections, I guess I want to say, of memory when you talk to a lot of people who've been in the same room, all of whom tell a slightly different story. None of you has ever had that experience, I'm sure. But for example, this happened with the Nabokov book. I read a book about Nabokov, whose wife, Véra, famously went to class with him every day he taught at Cornell over the 6 or 7 years when he taught in Ithaca. And no one really knew what she was doing in the classroom, and it was a great mystery because generally professors did not go to class accompanied by their wives, and in her case, by a very striking wife who always sat in the front row. And of course, the Greek chorus for that book were the years of Cornellians, all of whom had great theories as to what in the world she was doing in that classroom. Like, he was blind and she was the seeing eye dog. Or that wasn't his wife, that was his mother. Or she was there with a gun to protect him. I mean, they were just great.
She did have a gun, right?
She did have a gun. In fact, that person was on the money. But the not protecting him from co-eds, that wasn't entirely part of the story. But there was a sort of Greek chorus, and in an interesting way, the discordances in those voices was also useful, and it's fun to play with that when you're writing biography, because you do often get half the truth or the truncated truth or the partial truth. And it's important, I think, to layer that in and to make the reader aware of the fact that you can't necessarily always deliver the varnished truth.
Didn't several of his students also say that they were the model for Lolita? Wasn't there more than one?
There are a shocking number of women in America who believe themselves to be. It's a strange claim to fame. It's like saying I was Madame Bovary. I mean, why would you bring that upon yourself? There are also, just since we're on this subject, there are a common number of women in America, this has never happened to me in France, who believe that she is Cleopatra reincarnated.
Really?
And I met them all.
Every single one of them, yeah.
They come to book events.
Really and truly? Are there any Cleopatras with us tonight? No? You call Véra, since you're talking about Véra, morbidly private, but somehow she grew into an obsession. I mean, how do you tackle a morbidly private subject to write a big biography?
Ordinarily, you shouldn't. Is the long and short of it. What I knew about her could fit onto an index card. I mean, I knew that every book of Nabokov's, with one exception, is dedicated to Véra. And that's, as Nicholson Baker once said, that's like a nervous tick. Like, could you not think of anybody else to dedicate a book to? I knew she carried a gun. I knew she was Jewish and Nabokov was not, which was fairly unusual given his background. And I knew she went to class with him every day. And I think that was all that I knew. But if you had read the existing biographies of him, of which there were very few at the time, you would see the biographer essentially excuse her from the picture. He would say, his wife is, you cannot tell the story of Nabokov without mentioning his wife, but I won't be doing that here, was sort of the approach. And that was like a red flag to a bull for me. It's like, what do you mean? And it was really this whole, Nabokov could never have written what he'd written without Véra's cooperation. And then you turn the page and she's gone from the picture. And so you could almost hear the scraping of the chair as she excused herself from the room. Those books had been written during her lifetime, and the deal she had essentially made was, I will open the archives to you, I will give you access to my beloved husband, but you will leave me out of the story. And I came along very fortuitously several years after she had died, at a time when their son was in charge of the archive, and he was not, fortunately for me, he was not adverse to the idea of someone writing about his mother, but I thought it was the craziest idea I'd ever had for the entire time I worked on it.
Did other people think you were nuts to pick a subject like that?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it was hard enough to explain to people who Nabokov was, much less to say I'm writing about his wife. I mean, that just seemed irrelevant in the extreme. And then there was a reaction just before I published. I think the galleys were sent to a very distinguished feminist writer who read the book in galleys, was extremely aggrieved by Mrs. Nabokov taking second seat to her husband, having always sort of stood in his shadow, and wrote to my editor saying, I've read 20 pages and I've thrown it across the room. And I thought, so much for those 5 years.
Well, you didn't sell to that audience then.
I don't think I sold a book at that address, no.
Yeah. Tell us about the letters, your search for letters from on both sides.
I promised the publisher when I signed the contract to write that book that I would work from both sides of the Nabokov's correspondence. His letters were in Switzerland I thought that his letters were in the New York Public Library, which is where they were meant to be, but to which they had not yet been delivered. So the research was a little more expensive than I imagined because it was all of it in Montreux, where they were in a basement in Dmitri Nabokov's apartment. So that was where Nabokov's side of the correspondence was. Mrs. Nabokov's correspondence was missing. And obviously, it's very helpful to work from both sides of the letters. And for years, at one point, Dmitri Nabokov called me and said, my Aunt Sonia has died. She's left me these 5 shopping bags of letters. Probably they have my mother's letters in them. I got on an airplane literally the next day. I flew to Switzerland. And in those 5 shopping bags were postcards and tax receipts and shopping lists. Yeah, no letters. So it was a continual search for these missing, the Holy Grail for me, which were those letters, which never turned up, and that was always my great dream that they would, and now it's my great nightmare that those letters will turn up one day. But they never turned up. There's another piece of this which actually involves Paris, which is that Nabokov in 1937 was in Paris and Véra in Berlin with their infant son. And Hitler has just come to power. Véra is Jewish. It's a very uncomfortable situation. He's working very hard says he's working very hard to get his family out of Berlin. He's also having a torrid affair in Paris with another Russian woman. And word of that affair has reached Véra, although Nabokov doesn't know that she knows that he's having this torrid affair. And there is a set of letters between Nabokov and the then mistress, which is pretty good reading. And I knew of the letters, and I knew of some excerpts from the letters, and I came to Paris to see the collector who had bought those letters, and the conditions he set after arranging for an appointment with me at an undisclosed location. This is pre-cell phones and pre-GPS, so I was to get in a car with an unnamed driver and go to an undisclosed location at which many cigars were smoked, not by me, and we discussed how I was going to get these letters, and the terms essentially were if I was willing to provide him with some documents from Dmitri Nabokov's archive, he would happily let me see the letters. And obviously I never saw the letters because I don't generally steal from people's archives. So there was some lacuna in the research for that book. That's why I want to be a private investigator in my next life.
No, you don't. No. Stick with what you do. Let me take you back to the beginning because we've sort of jumped in medias res. How you got started, your first biography. You started out as an editor. You started out as an editor, and you started out like shortening, writing catalog copy and stuff like that, and stuff for, newspapers. And then all of a sudden, you get married, and on your honeymoon, you read Wind, Sand, and Stars, and you found yourself enchanted all over again. And as you once said, clearly one should pack carefully for one's honeymoon. I can't imagine what your honeymoon was like if you discovered this on your honeymoon. But that's for another day. I promised someone that I would not ask really personal questions, so I won't ask.
Okay, I totaled the car on our honeymoon. Did you really need to know
that? Did you really do that?
I did, yeah. And I'm still married to the same man who was in the car.
Well,
which is a
good.
shocking
This is
part.
great. This is great. He must really love you. Okay, now, you thought you were going to commission a biography because you were still an editor, so what happened?
It seemed Saint-Exupéry, because he lived so much between the two countries, had never really been dealt with equally well by someone who knew the French territory and knew the years in New York. And I, for many years, or for many months anyway, kept sitting down with writers who I thought, or agents who I thought would be able to provide the right person to do the book. And I would get to lunch and be unable to basically give up the idea. And after a relatively long time, because I can be dense about these things, it occurred to me that I really wanted to do it myself. And so my thinking there was to take a few years off, write the book, and then go back to publishing, where I was very happy. And the problem is that once you've written a biography, people think, shockingly, that you're a biographer. And that's when I did the Nabokov book. But the Saint-Exupéry really was kind of the love affair with France book, the feeling that, it was beginner's luck. It was an amazing moment to write about him because so many of the people who had known him, he dies in 1944, he dies young. The young American pilots who had flown with him in the war were all still around. The women he had known were all still around, and some of the El Postal guys were still around. So literally this was driving all over France to meet his former colleagues and mechanics and editors and girlfriends.
Well, you write, and you mentioned this briefly before, that facts are slippery and memories faulty, and you have said that among his friends, Saint-Exupéry's friends, were those who reported he was tone deaf and those who reported he sang splendidly. Some swore his eyes were blue, and others said they were brown, as they were. How do you grapple with these contradictions?
I think that, I don't know if this is true with you, that the cardinal rule for me with interviewing is you can stop interviewing when the person tells you things which you know are all of them untrue. And when they're telling you what you already have discovered or what you know is patently false, you feel like you've done your research. Sometimes we don't know the answer to those questions, and my feeling on that one is that the reader is somewhat reassured when the biographer can say on the page, we just don't know. And eye color aside, I would say the biggest one of those for me has been the death of Cleopatra, of which we have precisely two accounts. They are completely discordant one with the other. And you can't make sense of one if you're going to believe the other, but nor do we have any sense of who was writing the truth. One sounds like, well, they're very operatic, they're very overblown. One sounds like Puccini, one sounds like Wagner. And my way of dealing with it ultimately was just to have Cleopatra die twice. Once according to Plutarch and once according to Dio, because there's no way you can reconcile these two irreconcilable accounts. But I feel like that's the only honest way to do it. I don't know what you do in journalism when that happens.
You do just about the same thing. But this is why I think you'd make a great diplomatic correspondent, because you could say, the Americans say, Tony Blinken says this, but it is completely wrong because blah blah says this. Yeah. Okay.
I guess that was the great realization with the Cleopatra book, was precisely that, was that you had to pay as much attention to the sources and who was writing about her as you did about what they were saying. And to keep in mind, is this particular chronicler someone who has even set eyes upon Egypt? Is this particular chronicler someone who just in his bones pathologically despises Egyptians? And take whatever that chronicler has to say with that mountain of salt.
Well, before we delve deeper into Cleopatra, tell us a little bit about another woman, Saint-Exupéry's mistress, who had all sorts of delicious documents that you were called was it the Wall Street Journal who said she was the most seductive writer in all nonfiction today. How did you try to seduce her, and did you succeed?
That's going on my tombstone now that you mention it. I did not succeed. Did anyone know Nelly de Vogüé? I was warned that Nelly de Vogüé...
Maybe she's here.
She's not. Happily, she's not, I think, except in spirit. Was the longtime mistress of Saint-Exupéry and had not only a great number of documents and photographs, but obviously a great number of memories. And everyone warned me when I first went to see her. She had also written, I should say, one of the earliest biographies of him under a male pseudonym. And it took me a while to figure out which one of those books that might be. And then I realized one day it's the only book that doesn't mention his marriage. That was the thing that tipped me off. Everyone warned me when I went to see her that she was notoriously imperious, and she was probably going to be rather ferocious with me. And I thought, who could be ferocious with me? I was wrong. She was. And she basically tortured me sort of every Wednesday afternoon. I went to see her weekly while I was in Paris for a whole series of weeks. And used to say things to me like, I have all of these documents without which, you can't possibly write the book. They're crucial to your research. And just so you know, I'm leaving them to the Bayenne with a seal on them for 80 years, by which time you will be dead. So that was our relationship.
Are they still under seal?
Yeah, they're under seal.
Did you part amicably?
We parted amicably. I think the deal was that I would speak with her without recording anything, but I could not use her name in the book. And I think the book has subsequently been revised subsequent to her death so that she is now named in the book.
Okay.
And I don't know what is in the Bayenne, so.
The Bibliothèque Nationale. Yeah.
It's a terrible feeling. You develop a completion complex. Right?
And you've never thought of theft.
Thought I had my chance at theft and I missed it, right? I hear theft in libraries is a thing these days.
It is,
right?
yes, definitely, yeah. This is so bizarre. If you look at your subjects, they're all so different. How do you choose your subject?
How much time do we have?
We have, let's see.
I feel as if anyone can come up with a sort of universal theme here, I'd be really thrilled. I feel as if there's a sort of subterranean relationship in some way among the books, kind of like a fairy circle underground. But generally, my feeling is there's a question that I was setting out to answer in some way, or to which the subject speaks in some way. Often a question I myself don't realize until after I've written and often published the book. And that one of those questions sort of leads logically into the next. And sometimes I think it's also the research which determines where you go next. And the best example of that is that Cleopatra had been sort of in the atmosphere at home for a long time. It was actually my husband's idea. And it became a family joke, like she'll write the book when they find the diaries kind of thing. And then I came to Paris to research the Franklin in France book, for which there is a colossal amount of material which you can barely get through in a lifetime. There are 2.5 times as much pieces of paper for Franklin's 8.5 years in France as the entire rest of Franklin's life combined. So you just have an enormous alp of information. And yet, once you've been through all of that, there are basic questions about Franklin's life you can't answer. And somehow at the end of that, I thought, a subject with no archive? Excellent idea. I mean, and so between the sort of feeling like I needed to dry out after the Franklin immersion and the feeling that I had gone back to Plutarch and looked again at sort of what he says about Cleopatra, I felt like there was something that you could actually do with the little that we have about Cleopatra. And I felt as if it would be fun to play with that after the full Franklin immersion. And I can't remember what was in the news. I'd been writing a series of op-ed columns for the Times about women and power. And so this whole question of why is that such a dangerous intersection? Why do women always get accused of witchcraft when they acquire too much power? What is that about? Was really front and center in my mind, but I think to a certain extent I was conditioned by this this bath of Ben Franklin, thinking I would love to write about something where I have really limited materials to see if I can do that. So some of it, I guess, is the kind of mountain, and some of it is the topography itself.
Well, you approached the Cleopatra book a little differently. I mean, you have written and said that you mistrust autobiography, and that I think you said something like, one of the blessings of biography is you don't have to look at your own life. Yet your Cleopatra book put more of yourself into the Cleopatra book to kind of put some cement with between these bricks.
I think a subject who is elusive or recessive or very much behind the curtain brings the writer forcibly onto the page. So I think there is probably much more of me in the Nabokov book and in Cleopatra than there is in, say, The Witches or in Samuel Adams. Yeah.
Can you think of an example of how you revealed something about yourself in the Cleopatra book?
Not that I
or
would
the
mention in
Witches
public.
book?
No.
You mean we're going to have to go through 800 pages of the?
Yeah,
I
no,
guess I
I'm
didn't
not-
do my research well enough because I don't have a
No,
ready.
the whole point of being a biographer is that when they run a review, they put the subject's picture with the review, not the author's picture, which is like the best thing that ever happened,
Yes.
right?
So you don't like talking about yourself,
What gives you that idea?
and why do you find autobiographies suspect?
You know, there's a great line of Mark Twain's where he says autobiography comes in two versions, fake and faker. And I think I don't know how much memoir and autobiography the rest of you ingest. I tend to sort of just wolf it down. I think he had a point, right? This is the reason to write one. But I think the grain of salt is really always there, right? When you're writing an autobiography, you're posing it to a certain extent.
Well, you also have said that you don't come to your subject with a preconceived premise, or what the French would call a plan. It evolves along the way. Can you talk a little bit about the process of discovery and coming late to what your overarching theme is going to be?
You know, that's something that it occurred to me the other day is one of the reasons why I find this to be such an anxious-making business. Because I find that I need to live with an open mind, essentially, for the 3 or 4 years of research. It usually takes me about 3 or 4 years to research a book, during which time I'm trying very hard to absorb the material without coming to any serious conclusions or without imposing any way on the material my own preconceptions. And I mean, very often what you end up writing turns out to be what I end up writing anyway, turns out to be wildly different from what I had initially at least suspected. So I try very hard to keep myself from coming up with those conclusions, and I think that's a state of, it's like a recipe for anxiety, right? It's like an inconclusiveness at all times. You know, the mind doesn't like that feeling of uncertainty. And yet I feel it's essential, and I'm wondering if it's the same with you. I feel like it's essential to actually really taking in the material in front of you, that you not apply a pattern to it.
Well, you've said that it can take 5 or 10 or 15 years to write a book. I think I would jump out the window of my 9th arrondissement apartment if it took me that long to write a book. In fact, the book I just wrote, has taken longer than any of the other books. Because if you start life as a journalist, you're deadline driven, accuracy, deadline. Those are your 2 rules. So it's why I was a terrible investigative reporter. I couldn't do it. How do you do it without going totally nuts?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question, because I think I probably do go totally nuts.
No, you're a nice, normal person. You've got 3 kids.
We've
you're
only
married
just
to
met, obviously.
the same guy. But I used to cover the CIA. You got a nice husband who's, and
it's just that feeling that you've come to the material with a preconceived notion, I just think is sort of short. It's cutting off your subject at the knees, right? And I mean, the only Cleopatra comes to mind again, because I think for a long time I failed to notice how shrewd and strategic she was in her thinking. And I remember writing about 100 pages of that book. I have a better example as well, without realizing how incredibly crafty she was and how wily she was, and having to kind of go back and layer that into the first chapters. And I think part of that is I hadn't been able to sort of hover above the sources in the way that I think is sane and wise to do. A slightly different example is I did a book on the Salem witch trials called The Witches. And it begins immediately with people swearing in court that they have flown across the New England countryside on sticks, not only flown across the New England countryside on sticks to a satanic Sabbath, but also crashed on their way to the satanic Sabbath, which takes a lot of imagination, it seems to me, because you have to have like an aerial misfunction as part of your delusion. So that's where the book begins, and I'm 15 or 20 pages into writing this when I realized that to a modern reader, you need to explain what a witch was in the 17th century. And so obviously there's a certain amount of pulling the curtain back and saying, okay, now I need to give you a very quick crash course in what a 17th century New Englander meant when he said a witch. And again, that was my just not being able to sort of hover above the material in that way. Hover, fly.
Well, another way of hovering above the material, I guess, is deciding how to rewrite and how to cut. Publishers will tell you now they want you to write shorter. And readers will tell you they don't have patience for long books, so you write shorter chapters. I just want to read something that you once wrote or said about the editing process. And the writers in this room will appreciate this. Any piece of writing can be edited again and again. And that's, on the one hand, the beauty of the sport. Andy, my husband, do you hear that when I keep saying I want to rewrite my most recent book and take another 6 months? Okay. On the other hand, the frustration of it. I mean, I could take a book and happily make it better if I were to take a pencil to it again right now. It's an endless process of which the first 364 drafts, to my mind, anyway, are no good. And the 365th is perhaps acceptable.
Yeah, now 364 is a number that I clearly just made up on the spot.
Yes.
But it might be somewhere in the ballpark. There are a lot of drafts. They don't all look like that. And again, a lot of it is the search for concision. A lot of it is the cutting away the fat. A lot of it is the cutting away that great anecdote that you flew across the country to get, which you then realize adds nothing to the narrative. But because you paid for the plane ticket and you went into that garage and almost got fleas, it's going in the book. So there's a lot of that kind of thing. And there's a lot of realizing that if one person says something about your subject and another person says something along the same lines, you don't actually need both of those anecdotes, even though they're both divinely funny. One of those will suffice. And that the trick really is to get the reader to turn the page. And that is not necessarily what you're thinking, I think, when you're composing. That's what you think after you've put the manuscript in the drawer for 6 months, which is a luxury none of us has ever enjoyed, right? But you don't see until you look at it again later. And so a lot of it is carving the narrative out of this, vast sea of information that you have spent 3 or 4 or 5 years amassing.
But how do you stick with it?
I don't do anything else. That great recipe for how to write a book? You have to sit in a room, and you don't have to write, but you can't do anything else. Yeah. It does. I mean, I will say that once the writing begins, and I don't know if you feel the same way. I mean, the writing is at once the torment and the charm. And once the writing begins, it's like it's an exciting embryonic state. You feel that there's something electrical and alive, and it pulls you back to the point of you wanting to ignore everything else in your life, including children and small animals, right? And
it's not true. You were nursing one of your first child when you were writing your first book.
And you can tell. There's like a bump in that chapter where you can tell that I wasn't paying. And that's one I'd like to rewrite, actually. But there's just like, don't you have this feeling it's like there's a patient on the operating table and you shouldn't stray too far? It could just have a terrible thing could happen if you left the room for too long. And so there is an excitement, I think, of wanting to get back to it. But to get to that point is torture, or at least to get to that point is a long and arduous march through brambles.
And you always do your research first and then do your writing.
I have so many biographer in particular friends who write as they research. And I just can't figure out how you do that because I don't know where the story is. I don't know I just don't understand how one does that because I don't tend to see either the outline of the narrative or necessarily the quirks of the character until I have really been through most of the research. I know certain things, every once in a while you read something in an archive and you realize this is going in no matter what, or this is a great place to start a section of the book. But I can't see the whole, and again, I'm trying to maintain that kind of open-minded solicitude, which I don't have if I've already started writing.
But how do you not get overwhelmed by this mass of years of material?
I think I do get overwhelmed by it. I think one of the tricks later is how to make order and make sense of that. I don't have a great memory, so I'm forced to go back periodically and reread the research. And I go through all of it when I do each section of the book, which is I think probably a very, it's a very sane repetition of all of this material, so you can see what you actually have, and you begin to see parallels and pieces of things that speak to each other, and people saying the same thing 50 years later or in a slightly different way. And you begin to really sort of notice the trends and the nuances. But I don't think I would notice all of that if I were writing at the same time as I was researching. I think a lot of that depends on having amassed all of that material and then later tried to sort of begin to carve with it.
Well, this is, I want to pull you back a little bit to Benjamin Franklin, because it's Benjamin Franklin's time in Paris. And I don't know if how many of you have Apple Television, but, you know, Michael Douglas is now the Franklin, and you were a consultant on the program. What's he like?
You mean Ben Franklin or Michael Douglas?
Well, you choose.
I kind of know Ben Franklin better than I know Michael. Michael has better hair, significantly better hair. He's charming and lovely and down to earth, and you have no idea what being in a restaurant with Michael Douglas is like, or maybe you do. I didn't. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. Every single person in the kitchen, however, he will sign his piece of paper. It's amazing. Really lovely.
So how involved were you, and did they listen to you?
So this was a project that began maybe 15 years ago, and it became a sort of charmed project in that everyone involved, the producers, the writers, ultimately the director, were just brilliant and team players. And so it was really a charmed experience, which I'm sure has spoiled me for life. So early on, there was a lot of back and forth with the writer about the structure and the scenes and how far you could go in one direction or another. And then by the time Apple came on and they began to film, I became the sort of like doting aunt as opposed to the mother of the project. So it's no longer my Franklin, but there was a lot, I mean, very, very open and extremely sort of welcoming on every front. I mean, did I get to cast the thing? No. Did I get to go watch them film at Versailles? Yes.
Was it fun?
Yeah. Beats a day in the archives, you know.
Well, to get you back into the archives in the Franklin book, I just have to read something that you said during your when you were honored in 2017. You haven't lived until you spent days reading 18th century French penmanship on microfilm. It is my personal opinion that Lafayette's penmanship tutor should be tarred and feathered. There is less of him in my Franklin book than probably there should be, for the simple reason that his handwriting is indecipherable.
And I don't know if I went on to say that I confessed that rather sheepishly to the great historian Peter Gay, with whom next to whom I had an office at one point. And I said, I don't know what to do. I have this problem. And he said, Stacy, do you not know Gay's law of history? And I said, no. What is that? And Peter said, if you can't read it, it didn't happen. So I felt immediately better. But to this day, I do feel like Lafayette got short shrift.
Yeah. Well, and there's another delicious anecdote in that speech about just how challenging it can be working in France. There was an
which I'm sure comes as a great surprise to everyone in this room.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm sharing it. There was an archivist at the Quai d'Orsay who decided, seemingly on a whim, that I should no longer be allowed to handle original documents, and who downgraded me to microfilm. No amount of pleading, no letters from agents, publishers, or ambassadors would change her mind. I considered dedicating the book to her out of spite.
I didn't realize I'd said that about the dedication. You know, the dedication page is the one page that writes itself. I mean, it's so right. It's so much fun to write the dedication page, and I really wanted to say, like, in spite of. Not going to mention her name, but I didn't think I was.
I've got one of those at the Louvre, so I've got.
You do?
Yeah, in spite of. Yeah, that's really quite good.
Exactly. Despite, I think I did say in the acknowledgments something where if you read between the lines, it's basically despite the best efforts of this person. You know, I worked my way through this material, but yes, basically she didn't think I was writing a real book, so I was therefore from that day on, for no reason I really understood, to be essentially sent to microfilm. And that was, by the way, an election year, so there were a lot of strikes. So already I was up against, terrible odds, because, the half the shelf would be unavailable Monday to Wednesday, and the other half of the shelf, Thursday and Friday, depending on who was striking that week.
Right. Don't you love it when you go into one of those archives and they're supposed to be open and then they're not?
Curiously, this doesn't happen in North America.
No. Well, it's about time that I have to turn this over to our audience, and you and I will talk later
about the book we'll be writing or the podcast we're doing.
My husband is having a fit back there, but let's give her a big hand. And how do we do questions? Emily, do you
raise your hand very high, and I will bring you a microphone. We've got a hand in the back. Speedy.
I'll go first. Hi. I had a question about kind of like the afterlife of a biography, especially like in the age of where so much information is like being tossed around and on social media and all of those things. Like, do you ever feel like you're like, oh, I wish I could, like you said with the letters from Nabokov's wife, or is there like some scenario where you would return to a book because something came out that you feel like you need to address?
That's such a great question. This is the reason not to write about Amelia Earhart, because any minute now they might find the plane, and then you have to revise the book, right? It's such a good question. There's, as biographers would tell you, there's dead and there's very dead. And as you may have noticed with my books, I tend to be, sticking with the very, very dead. And I think part of it is, consciously or not, that I'm so afraid of that kind of thing. Well, first of all, I'm afraid of people, so having to interview people is very hard for me. But also just the fact that a batch of letters could surface, or suddenly it will turn out that someone was bisexual and you missed it, that kind of thing. You don't want that to happen. This is why people, for my Saint-Exupéry book, there is now an appended afterward when they did find his plane. So you can sometimes correct these things, in a very gentle way. The nice thing about Cleopatra, very unlikely that we're ever going to find her diary. The nice thing about Samuel Adams, also very unlikely we're ever going to find his diary. But to your question of do I ever return, I have just gone back to Ben Franklin, not because I found new material, but because I felt I wasn't done with him yet, or he wasn't done with me. So I'm now writing about Franklin again. It's the first time I've gone back to something that is familiar. It feels like a reunion in a way. And I'm trying to convince myself that was a good idea, but he's exceptionally good company, and there's so much about which I couldn't write because I was confined to the French years. And there are 12 million Franklins, which is the beauty of writing about Franklin. There's so many sides to this man. He's round. So there's just a sense there of great sort of joy, really, in being in the presence again of this person whom I felt so fondly toward for those 12 years or whatever it was.
Other questions?
Thank you. So you do 364 drafts. Do you actually go through the entire book, revising it before you move on to the next draft, or you do one chapter at a time, revise it? And secondly, one reason for doing research along the way, I suppose, is while you're doing the editing, you find that there are some holes perhaps that you want to fill. So you might maybe have to do a little extra research in that context.
I'm going to take your questions in reverse order, because that's entirely true. And you sometimes turn a corner and realize that you turn the page and you realize, wait, I forgot to research this. Or an archive turns up about which you didn't know. One of those for me with Saint-Exupéry was there was a woman in his life whom I had known he knew in New York during the years when he's very despairing and he's writing The Little Prince. And I hadn't given her a second thought, really, and then I discovered that her archives were at the Smithsonian in Washington, but it was easier somehow to get from New York to Paris than from New York to Washington. So I put it off for the longest time, and then I read these papers which made it very clear that she was a very, very intimate friend, and he had been nearly suicidal, and she may have been the only person to whom he spoke of that kind of despair. And I knew nothing else about her. I knew she had some connection to the art world. And I called a friend who, in the art world, who basically said to me, of course, that Hedda Stern is Mrs. Saul Steinberg, and she lived 10 blocks from me. Okay, so I put this off for 3 or 4 years, and in fact, there she was, and yes, had these astonishing stories to tell. So that was another case where I kind of just didn't get there. Fortunately, I got there in time, but it didn't occur to me to do it in the natural order of things. And to your question about massaging the pages, which, if you gave me one now, I would continue to rewrite it, the published one. I do it as I go. And a lot of that is that something may fall out of a chapter that you realize doesn't belong there, and so you're going to stick it in later. And that process continues even later when you're in galleys or when you're discussing things with your editor, something we didn't talk about, because of course, who wants to talk about being edited? But I feel as if I need to have a solid foundation from which to launch myself to the next set of pages before I can move on. And so even though I know there will be yet another revision or a slight revision, I just kind of need to know from what I am launching myself before I can really kind of get going. And some of that has to do with the tone of the book. I feel as if you have to find the right voice for each particular book, that they're not all the same. And once you've found that, it's a little easier to move on. That's endearing. That's not. That's adorable.
I mean, you mentioned editor. Do you work with one editor, and what is your relationship with your editor?
So for the last 3 books, I have had the same editor with whom I've just lost, and who has been fabulous, but a little light-handed for my taste. I think people think at a certain point in your career you know what you're doing, which isn't necessarily the case. But this last book, The Revolutionary, was edited both by my longtime editor, who is now the CEO, and the editor-in-chief, who had very different opinions. And it was great because it was like, Mommy says this and Daddy says this. I don't have to listen to either of them. It was great. I felt like I was running right through the middle. But it was interesting to see how 2 different people edit. And in distinction to what you said, they wanted the book to be longer, and I wanted the book to be shorter. And there was a real tug of war between us. Their feeling was, revolutionary history, people expect, Bob Carroll writes big books, and Ron Chernow writes big books, you should be writing a big book. And I think my thinking was, this is a story that I really want to have fly once you start. And there was a lot of push and pull about the length of the book.
If I can ask a follow-on to your question, who's your reader? Because this was an issue with the Sam Adams book, because you got reviewed by academics, and they basically said, why am I reviewing this book for the New England blah blah, because this is a scholarly book, this is a scholarly journal, and this book couldn't go through peer review at my whatever university. And so how do you decide who's going to read this? Is the scholar going to read this? Am I going to be judged by all these academics at American universities, or am I trying to explain this to a more down to earth person? I
think by saying that the goal here is to make the reader turn the page, what I'm saying is I'm writing a trade book. I mean, I'm writing a book for the general reader, and I'm assuming from what I have read of academic books that is not the audience for which the academic is writing. I've also discovered over the years that once you have sold a certain number of books, academics don't like you anymore. I don't know why that is, but no one really notices you when you've only sold 2,000 copies. But once you have a bestseller, academics really like to review you. But I do feel like it's a very different audience, and I feel that the consideration here is to be as scrupulous as possible. You might notice I write a lot of endnotes, but to be able to write a story that actually reads like, if not literature, at least reads like something that is pleasurable. And that the obligation, in fact, the difficulty of doing it comes precisely there, that you're essentially having to have swallowed this entire shelf of academic literature and turned it into something that is actually a pleasant, or at least an engaging read. That's the goal. I don't necessarily think I've succeeded at it.
In that context, would you consider working with Ken Burns?
I adore Ken Burns, and he did a Ben Franklin 2-part thing that you've probably seen, which is fabulous, with which I did work with him, and I would be happy to work with him at any point. I think he's a master of doing this on the screen, right? That's the opposite of academic from my point of view. Also, he has the advantage that he gets to use images, which is kind of not fair, because once you have an image in your mind, it's less work, right, obviously, to ingest the image than it is to ingest the word description.
We have a question on Zoom from Kevin. Kevin would like to know, with the debut of the Franklin series on Apple TV+, did you find that there were limitations with the medium of television in terms of time and what it's able to represent? Were there particular details that you wish could have been covered with more depth or in a different way, or are you fully satisfied?
It's such a good question. I didn't really ever look at it as my project. I don't know where to look for Ken. Is Ken on the screen?
Kevin is inside that camera right there, yes.
So I didn't really know. It wasn't really my doing, there was a great deal of discussion about the structure of how to essentially break those years in Franklin's life into 8 episodes. It was always 8 episodes. And there was a lot of kind of pushing and pulling of things in and out of the frame. It was astonishing to me how much liberty, I mean, obviously, my hands are tied. I can only essentially report what actually happened. When you're making a TV series, you can move things temporally, you can invent characters, you can discard characters. So, for example, Franklin sails to France in 1776 with 2 grandsons. In the series, there's only 1 grandson. There are 2 spies in his household. In the series, there is only 1. So the discarding of things to make for smooth sailing was something I was a little jealous of, I think, because I can't do that. Again, so is working with images, a little jealous making, because it's just so much more arduous to have to create that kind of a feel on the page. It takes me so many pages to say what colonial Boston smelled like or felt like, and you can do that with an image if you're on the screen, and that just doesn't seem fair.
We have time for one final question. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. I really enjoyed it. I know you said the idea of interviewing a subject who's alive or writing about a subject who's alive is horrifying, but if you were to do your work kind of 100 years from now or 200 years from now, who's alive today would you want to write about?
So you want me to say Taylor Swift, right? Dolly Parton, maybe? It's such a great question. I so veer from, it's the one thing I've never done. I've never written about anybody who's alive. And there was a fleeting moment this time around where I sort of half considered it. And part of me is just put off, part of it is that I am innately shy and it's difficult for me. Part of it is that I feel like you don't have the clinical distance in someone's lifetime that you have after they're gone, when people can speak freely, when the papers are open, when you get to the truth a lot more easily. I mean, Franklin said this brilliantly when he said 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. And I just have to really subscribe to that feeling that if you're going to do this in a way that seems enduring, you need to wait. There needs to be a grace period there, if at least a half a generation, if not a whole generation, for that really to happen. The interviewing thing is just really hard for me, but it's particularly hard when you're going to see an 85-year-old woman and you have to ask her if 50 years earlier, 60 years earlier, she slept with Nabokov. I mean, I can't ever do that again.
Can we have a final round of applause, please, for Stacy and Elaine?